So this webinar, as I said, is being hosted at California Center for Cooperative Development. This webinar series called Promoting Shared Wisdom Through Cooperative Connections has been running since May, and we have a few more webinars ahead, so be sure to keep your eye out. If you're not familiar with our center, we are a statewide nonprofit. We are a technical assistance provider, so we're working directly with co-ops that are both startup all the way to established. And we are also an educational entity, so we are promoting awareness and understanding of the cooperative model. Now, I would like to introduce you to those who are leading our discussion today. Grant is a planner for the city of Escondido in San Diego County. He has a master's in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. And while a faculty member of the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at UIC, he co-developed a graduate class for students on the sharing economy. Grant was also the researcher and contributor to the paper Cooperative Cities, Municipal Support for Worker Cooperatives in the United States, which was published in May of 2019 in the Journal of Urban Affairs. Jumping over to Kirk. Kirk is a native New Yorker, NBC technologist, former high-tech professional, community activist, and small business owner of two pizza shops down in the South Bay in the San Francisco Bay Area. In 2006, he and his wife created the first A Slice of New York shop, and then in 2017, they transitioned the business to a worker-owned co-op, of which Kirk is a member. Kirk continues to advocate for employee ownership as an option for business owners, as well as works with local, state, and national resources to grow the co-op movement. In 2019, he was appointed special advisor to the mayor for the city of Santa Clara. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Kirk and Grant.
So while the poll is up, can you see the screen as well, or is the outline displayed right now?
Yeah.
Grant, you want to walk us through that?
Sure. We're gonna we just did the quick questions to start up the presentation here. We're going to talk about some long-term economic trends and the impact of COVID-19. We're going to give a little bit of background on cooperatives. And then we're going to be talking about converting to a worker cooperative. And why do this? Kirk's going to be talking about his personal experiences as well. We're going to be talking about some cooperative public policies across the country at multiple levels of government. So at the local level, state level, and federal level. And then we have a discussion on how to accelerate the growth of cooperatives. How do we see these institutions grow across the country? So we have some ideas on how to do that. And then we're going to give you some information about a page that we created and a handout that we're going to give to you. It's a resource handout with a lot of information on cooperatives that can help you in your own education and also help to educate others about cooperative institutions. And of course, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end, and also in between, we'll take some breaks in between to take on some questions and have a discussion with you as well. So I think that this is a good way to start the presentation. This is a quote from Elinor Ostrom. If you don't know about Elinor Ostrom, she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics. She won it in 2009, kind of crazy it took that long. But her expertise was on the management of common pool resources, so fisheries, the deep oceans, things like that. She is very relevant to cooperative economics and cooperative institutions because she dealt in a lot of her research on collective action problems. So collective action problems are situations where people have to work cooperatively towards a common end. And there are sometimes problems that arise as part of the collective action problems, obviously. And so Elinor Ostrom, she demonstrated in her research how trust, reciprocity, mutual aid is important as far as dealing with collective action problems. So if you're interested in cooperative economics and cooperative institutions, I would recommend reading Elinor Ostrom and her 1990 book in particular, Governing the Commons. But I think her quote here sets up the presentation pretty well. Extensive empirical research leads me to argue that a core goal of public policy should be to facilitate the development of institutions that bring out the best in humans. We need to ask how diverse, polycentric institutions help or hinder the innovativeness, learning, adapting, trustworthiness, levels of cooperation of participants, and the achievement of more effective, equitable, and sustainable outcomes at multiple levels. So there have been some long-term policy trends in this country that are becoming increasingly contentious. And I think it really calls for the need of alternative policies and alternative institutions. So we're not going to be able to touch on all of these policies right now, but if you want to return to the slide and discuss this later, we can do that. But the first one I did want to talk about was policies and institutions that encourage the offshoring of production. So we used to have a much stronger industrial sector here in the United States. We used to produce a lot more here in the US. And the workers who worked in those sectors in the industrial sector got paid good wages, had good benefits. Those jobs have been offshored and the factories are now elsewhere. And what's replaced those jobs are lower paying jobs with less benefits. And the so-called precariat has increased. The amount of people that are precarious and superfluous to the economy has increased. So people are doing gig work and part-time work just to make the ends meet. This is a company that pushed towards automation. So the Obama administration in December of 2016 did a study on automation and AI technology. And they found that in the next couple of decades, as many as 40% of jobs domestically can be eliminated via automation. So there's been a push to offshore and eliminate lots of good paying jobs, and the jobs that are replacing them don't pay as well and don't have as good of benefits. There's also been a linking as part of this process at the local workforce with the workforce in other countries that have much lower wages and much weaker labor protections. And so that's had a downward pressure on wages and also impacted the power differential between employers and employees here in the US. The next thing I wanted to talk about briefly was austerity. So austerity refers to the cutback in public sector spending. That's particularly important when there's public sector cutbacks in spending at the federal level, because the federal government is the public institution that is responsible for creating the currency that we use. It creates the currency through the Treasury or the Federal Reserve. In recent decades, the federal government has cut back spending, which has led eventually to state and local governments cutting back spending as well. And so when there are austerity at the federal level, when the government's injecting less money into the economy, there's less money available at the state and local level, and that results in cuts in services and cuts in the public sector workforce. There's hundreds of thousands of less workers now working in the public sector than there was when the crash first hit in 2007 and 2008. So there's, as far as these long-term policy trends, they've had long-term macro and microeconomic impacts. One of them is large and growing inequality. So there's large growing inequality society-wide, and one measure of this is the Gini coefficient. It measures income inequality. And income inequality, according to the Gini coefficient, has increased by about 20% since the early 1980s. There's also an inequality within firms. So the AFL-CIO keeps track of the CEO to worker pay ratio, and Bloomberg News had an article recently on that, and it showed that the CEO to worker pay ratio within large institutions has increased by 1,000% since the early 1950s. So there's been an increase in inequality society-wide and also within institutions. And there's been a rise in the cost of basic necessities like housing, education, and healthcare at the same time that there's been a decades-long stagnation in real wages. So the things that we need, the necessities that we need, are increasing in price relative to our wage, and that's been the case for a long time. So these things are becoming increasingly unaffordable for an increasing percentage of the population.
And then just the last thing we're just going to touch on here is the kind of the opportunity for succession planning. We're really bad at succession planning and general planning for the future, writing wills, all that stuff. We think we're going to live forever. And one of the things that, for example, co-ops can do is actually be a succession plan. Like, how do you have an exit strategy? Always figure out how to make yourself redundant is kind of that strategy. And this is a way to do that. That's not something we have done right now, but it's something you could do.
So there's been these long-term trends as far as policy and as well as economic outcomes, and that's been exacerbated by the economic fallout from COVID-19. And here in the state of California, as of November 2019, there was a budget surplus of about $7 billion. The politicians at the time were debating, how are we going to spend the surplus? Fast forward about a half a year later, and there's a $54 billion deficit. So $61 billion change for the worse in about half a year. I saw a study recently where collectively states in the United States have a debt of between $280 billion and $300 billion now. And at the local level here in California, there's an aggregate $7 billion deficit in the next couple of years, and most local governments are now considering layoffs and cuts. So COVID-19 has had a negative impact as far as the fiscal situation at the state and local level, and they're responding by cutting services and workers.
And when you look at small business in terms of what do you have in your reserve, like big business, like tech and all that, they have lots of reserves. That's why they can weather this very easily. But small business, I thought about, it's like, yeah, 2 months reserves, does that seem reasonable? And the reality is I looked, when we planned our transition, our working capital, we only planned, I think our working capital, we made sure we could cover payroll for at least 3 to 4 weeks. And that was it. And that's, I think, the reality. And that's, I think, a luxury. I don't even think most businesses can cover that if you're at full payroll. Now, if you're not at full payroll, you just got to cover expenses, no labor. We're 40% labor, 45% labor. So that may be a little bit different when you cut all, like you had to cut all salaries and just focus on your expenses. Maybe you can cover that with that same amount of money. But the thing that, in addition to that, you have this kind of vacuum of business now. Like one of our businesses in Sunnyvale, we're corporate based. So corporate catering in the mornings, corporate lunches, we're right in that kind of triangle right by Google and Facebook and Apple and all those. Well, come mid-March, it all just evaporated and it's gone to zero. And in our case, we actually had to reduce our slice business. We're a pizza shop, so we sell by the slice. We reduced that because that behavior of kind of window shopping for slices is the wrong thing to do in a pandemic. You want people to come in and you go out. You can't do that with slices. So we saw not just our availability to sell stuff go down, but also the people coming in to consume that go down significantly.
So I think this calls for the need for changes at the policy level, but also change at the institutional level. We don't just need different policies at the national and local level, we need different institutions. And this quote here is from 2011. You might note this is a couple years after the crash in 2007 and 2008. I think this quote is actually more relevant now than it was even then, given what's going on. The past 3 years show us why it's time to consider a different approach to ownership cooperatives. If more assets and businesses were owned and controlled by the people who use them, our economy would be more stable. And I couldn't agree more with the sentiment.
So we're just going to take just a quick walk down what a cooperative is. I'm not going to read the quote that's there. You can read that, but basically it's a fair and equitable society. And that's really the heart of what a cooperative is. It's how do you create a fair relationship between all the participants, the workers, including vendors and everybody that you deal with in that ecosystem. And what I compare to is kind of like what a city government looks like, where you have members, which are equivalent to residents. You have an elected board of the members, the board elects, or the members elect the board, which is similar to like a city council. And then you have a general manager, which is similar to like the city manager of the city, which runs the city. And then you have the operating agreement of, in our case, an LLC, that is the constitution of the business, which is similar to a charter or a constitution of a city. And all of these things have governance, committees, assets, and resources that they have to manage. So it's very similar. It's kind of like this sovereign nation that you create in its thing. So let's go on to some examples of what cooperatives are. So you have a consumer cooperative, which, in case you weren't familiar, REI is probably the biggest in the nation. That's where you get that little check at the end of the year, depending on how much you spend. You have selling cooperative or producer cooperatives, which have multiple vendors come together to sell. The California Dairies is an example of that, and they sell to others. Then you have financial cooperatives. These are all credit unions. So if you didn't know all credit unions were cooperatives, they are. And then lastly, in this example, we're going to talk about worker cooperatives. And worker cooperatives are where the workers make up all of the owners. In order to be an owner, you need to actually work and create the product that you're selling in there. So those are just a quick high level of the cooperative landscape. And we're going to pause here just for a second, see if there are any questions that Gianna wants to bring up, or if anyone wants to bring up.
Yeah, so we did have one question come through, which is kind of more of a consideration of the content you'll be presenting today. Zola was asking if you'll be covering transitioning, I believe, to a worker co-op during the pandemic. So just wanted to share that comment with you.
Yeah, so what we're going to cover what we did to a transition. It's not obviously directly in a pandemic. We did this 3 years ago, actually 3 years ago, this last July or this month. And I just talked to somebody in Southern California who I was working with 6-7 months ago that is in the process of transitioning right now. They started, I think, March 16th. or 18th or 21st or something like that. They just started when this was starting, and they're still going through. She's very excited in the process. Her team is very excited. So it is actually happening in Southern California.
Yeah, we have some information that we're going to be talking about a little bit later that is various ways in which you can support worker cooperatives both within the public sector and through private initiatives. Some of them are going to be financial support, a lot of it because of, especially in the public sector, because of budgetary issues. It's going to be difficult right now, but there are still things that can be done, in particular in regards to education, educating the populace, educating public sector officials, and among others, about cooperative institutions that can go a long way towards working towards transitioning to a worker cooperative. So we are going to cover that a little bit later, and a lot of the policies and things we're going to go over, I think, are applicable to the present context.
And then just to bring this up again, because I think some folks were still joining when this question came through, but David was asking about data kind of from a national perspective on co-ops and how they've been faring during COVID. I wanted to mention something that comes to mind is the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops has been very much hands-on with a lot of co-ops across the country during the COVID era, providing not only kind of support, but also trying to understand their needs and kind of struggles through the pandemic. So while they don't reflect all of co-ops, they do reflect one specific sector. And I think that they might have some insight, if not now, in the future, from all this work that they've been doing with their member co-ops.
And we're going to share a resource list at the end of the session here, which will be available to everybody, that will give you pointers on who you could reach out to as well.
And then, sorry. Just a last plug for our attendees. If you do have any more questions, please direct them to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will continue to share them with Kirk and Grant throughout the presentation.
Yeah, I was just going to briefly say that I'm not aware of any studies that study the impact on worker cooperatives in particular. I did try to look for that, so I don't think it's there, but I'm sure it's going to be the case in the coming years. And if you're out there and you're working in the cooperative sector, if you're working on policy and research, it certainly is an opportunity for you to do that. It'd be good information. But I'm not aware of any studies at this point to study that in particular. Okay, so just a quick rundown of cooperatives by the numbers. There are different types of cooperatives. Kirk mentioned a few of them. So worker cooperatives, there's roughly 400 to 500 worker cooperatives employing approximately 8,000 workers in the US. There's approximately 6,400 housing cooperatives. There are a number of agricultural cooperatives, especially in the Midwest and the South, approximately 6,900. There's about 614 grocery cooperatives. I'm a member of one here in San Diego. There's approximately 48,000 financial cooperatives, mainly in the form of credit unions, and total approximately 70,000 cooperatives employing up to 1 million people. And you can see down here on the bottom left, it's the cooperative principles. The International Cooperative Alliance has a cooperative principle that they agreed to end in 1985, and these are some of the cooperative principles down here. So it's worth checking out as well.
So what makes cooperatives special or different? And I would just focus on three main things. The first is accountability. You're accountable to each other as a team. You have relationship with each other. You're working together, but you're also, you know that what you're doing is for a common goal and common good for each other and helping each other. The other thing is, it is a pure democracy in the sense that it's one person, one vote. I mean, that, at least from a worker cooperative perspective, you have every member's voice is equal. You don't have someone that has, 50% of the vote and everybody else is kind of watered down like that. Everybody has an equal share now, and they elect their board, and their board represents. So you have that kind of voice that's always looking out for its members. But then the members actually can vote on specific things together. And if you have an issue, you can bring that up and your voice is heard consistently. And then the last thing I'm going to touch on this one, there's again other information on here, but the other thing that I'd like to call out is equity. The purpose around some of the biggest benefits of a co-op is equity. It is based on how you treat people fairly and how you respect each other's work product and how you respect each other's time, and that you are part of that team that looks out for each other and is getting compensated for your contribution. So the more you work and the more you put in, the more you are receiving for the work done. That is some of the fundamental things that I think we tend to not see as often, where we have more of an exploitative workforce out there where you have few doing a lot of the work, and then you have kind of people at the top getting all those rewards. So this is it's a wealth building opportunity, as well as a fairness, and there's social justice in there, but it's also a business. And this is a for-profit business. We're not a charity, we're not a club, we're not a gift. We're competitive in the workforce.
So there's a lot of different institutional types. Why worker cooperatives? Why this enterprise type versus others? I think there's a number of characteristics that make cooperatives a really powerful tool for endogenous and equitable economic development. So multiple studies show that worker cooperatives pay higher wages than other business types. In a traditional business, you have your labor and you sell the labor to the business owner. And the larger the gap between the value you produce with your labor versus your wage, that surplus goes to the business owner. When the workers own the enterprise, the money that would otherwise go to the business owner goes to them. There obviously has to be a sacrifice by the workers collectively for the enterprise. It has to be a viable institution. But nonetheless, the studies do show that worker cooperatives do tend to pay higher wages. The cooperatives keep local businesses local, not just the enterprise itself, but the money flowing in the local economy. So one of the issues with economic development is money leaking out of the local economy. Worker cooperatives, because they are place-based institutions, because the owners of the cooperative necessarily live close to the cooperative, it keeps the money itself flowing in the local economy. They are equitable institutions. I mentioned the CEO to worker pay ratio going back to the early 1950s. Within worker cooperatives, there are often pay differentials within the cooperative, which can change over time. Mondragon, which I'll talk about a little bit later, has increased over time, the internal pay differential, but nonetheless, cooperatives tend to be internally more equitable than other business forms. They're an important form of succession planning. Within a worker cooperative, when you're thinking about selling your business to other people, to somebody else, one of the people that you would think of is the workers. They have a lot of tacit knowledge. They've been working at the enterprise. They know how it works. They know how things function. And so worker cooperatives tend to be a good solution as far as succession planning. They're democratic workplaces. The democracy internally does change depending upon the size of the institution. So I mentioned Mondragon in Spain. Mondragon is the largest worker cooperative in the world. It was formed in the Basque region of Spain in the 1950s. The Mondragon Corporation essentially is a collection of cooperatives, over 200 cooperatives employing over 70,000 workers. It's in 35 countries now too, so it's grown really large. You could imagine trying to make democratic decisions in a direct democratic way be virtually impossible. So when you get to be a larger institution, the democracy is more representative. You can't really decide things as you would as a smaller enterprise. But nonetheless, it is a democratic workplace, either direct democracy or representative democracy. Studies do show that there's a benefit as far as a democratic spillover. So this refers to democratic workplaces spilling over into the local communities and benefiting the local communities. Studies show that the democratic workplace, the more somebody operates in a democratic workplace, the more likely they are to engage in civic participation and political engagement and other things within their local community. So the democracy spills over from the workplace to their communities. It's a means of educational and skills attainment, especially with people that have less formal education. And if you run a business, you have to know how accounting goes. You have to know how to do payroll and so forth. So in forming a worker cooperative, it's a means of skills and educational attainment for people. Studies show that cooperatives have high survival rates relative to other enterprise forms. So that's really important when we're going through something like this, which is an economic downturn. When there's an economic downturn, the economy is contracting. And when there's less money coming in, a traditional business will lay workers off. Well, laying workers off further depresses demand, which results in other businesses laying workers off, and you're in a downward spiral. Worker cooperatives tend to keep people employed. They will spread the pain a bit. You'll be in times of economic stress, you will be making a little bit less money. But in keeping people employed, you keep effective demand going in the economy when the economy is otherwise contracting. So it's counter-cyclical in that regard. And there are important means of wealth accumulation among low-income people. A good example of this domestically is the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland. The Evergreen Cooperatives focus on hiring people that were getting out of jail, and they were trying to be reintegrated back into society. A lot of the people that were hired by the Evergreen were poor people, low-income people. Not only have the Evergreen Cooperatives provided good paying jobs, but they've also helped people buy homes. They've helped them with furthering their education. So it's been a really important tool for wealth accumulation among low-income people. So cooperatives have historically grown for different reasons. One of the big ones is at times of systemic crisis. In the late 19th century, there was a series of very deep economic depressions, and the labor movement was active then. Working conditions for working people were often pretty horrific. And so working people would form mutual aid societies and various forms of cooperatives. The biggest one in the late 19th century was the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor were the largest labor organization at that point in time in the world, and they formed hundreds of worker cooperatives across the country. In the 1930s and after the 1920 crash and during the Great Depression, there was a lot of self-help cooperatives that were formed in California, Los Angeles and San Francisco, the Bay Area in particular. And out of these self-help cooperatives, now the mutual aid organizations, you saw various forms of cooperatives form, including worker cooperatives. In the 1960s and 70s, there was another growth in cooperatives, which came out of the counterculture, but people who were thinking of different policies and institutions, different ways to run society and the economy. And then now, because of the things that I mentioned, these long-term economic trends, these long-term macro and microeconomic impacts, people are looking to alternative policies and institutions. And I think that it's a really good environment to see the growth of cooperatives. And I hope that the cooperative growth is sustainable in ways it wasn't in the past. It's often been, worker cooperative is often grown in response to oppression. So Jessica Gordon Nemhard has a book I would recommend everybody reading called Collective Courage. And she talks about how cooperatives formed often out of mutual aid societies. African Americans in the 19th century would be escaping slavery, and they would form mutual aid societies to help them get through society. They, in the 20th century, would be dealing with employment, housing discrimination, outright racism, violence. And in order to deal with that, in order to deal with the society as it was then, they would form mutual aid societies. And out of those mutual aid societies, you would see cooperatives form, various forms of cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, housing cooperatives, grocery cooperatives, and of course, worker cooperatives as well. Jessica Gordon Nemhard in her book Collective Courage says that almost all of the ones that she studied, the cooperatives actually formed out of book and discussion clubs. So people get together, they discuss cooperative economics, they discuss cooperative books, they talk with one another, they find out that they like each other, and out of those books and discussion clubs, people would form cooperatives. So that was an important means, just getting together and discussing them, kind of like we are now, would get people to get together, and out of that would come cooperatives. And also, as Kirk has mentioned, when there's a need in regards to business succession planning, they've historically grown here and abroad as well.
And then this is kind of like a general slide just to say, you know, what can you look at in your own community? Like how can you apply these thoughts, principles? How can you engage? What elements can you look at to help influence and change and help shape how your community embraces some of these topics or ideas? And so again, we're going to just pause for a minute here so that we can take any questions. We're make sure we keep on time schedule too. I think we're a little behind, but I think that's okay because we're taking questions along the way.
So just to kind of keep in the same thread from what you were just talking about, one question came through about what are some resources to subscribe to besides CCCD to keep up with cooperative policy changes and news? So
that's a great question. Yeah. And we're gonna you have to wait to the end of this session to find out. I'm just kidding. We have a resource guide that we created, and we also have a listserv that we're gonna ask that you join to help get that engaged. And there's a bunch of resources that we can point you to as well.
Kind of like in line with what I was saying, not just the resources themselves, but I hope and after this conversation that people can kind of get together and network in addition to just the resources and the information for their own education or spreading knowledge elsewhere. I hope people can kind of start networking together that maybe already aren't, and out of that they can form cooperatives as well. So maybe after this we can exchange information.
And one of the biggest cooperative principles is cooperation amongst cooperatives. I don't know which principle that is. It's like 6 or something like that. But the biggest thing that I see that is people helping each other. Like, how can we help each other get to the next step? And how can we really change, move the needle in how we do business here in our country?
Mm-hmm.
Danielle has a few different questions about worker co-ops. The first one is she's interested in learning how worker ownership shares work if some worker owners are doing vastly different things or working vastly different hours than others.
So I can just tell you in our case, we don't require, membership is voluntary, and I think in all cooperatives membership is voluntary. In our business, we actually have a shared. We have workers that are members and workers that are non-members. So not everybody in our business is a member of the co-op, and roles do change differently. The way again, I hope this answers the question. I'm not sure if it's exactly answering it, but the reality is you get paid based on your contribution, whether your shifts are different, whether your times are different. If you work 30 hours, you're getting 30 hours of participation and 30 hours of relative profit that you've created in the business. That's how that's by right. Now, if there are different skills, like Arizmendi has a flat salary. They just pay straight salary to everybody. Everybody makes the same. And then for administrative roles, they have, I think, per diems or other ways to compensate for that as an extra role. We don't have that. I'd love to be able to have a single salary structure. We're not at that point where we have enough revenue to do that. I think they're established enough they can do that. We can't do that yet, but that would be a great goal. But you can also tier stuff. I mean, you can have people with doing certain things. The big thing is not, you don't have this big disparity. You don't have someone making 15 times more than somebody else. Here we're 1 to 2x. We're not even 2x from anybody, and that may be maybe too close, and you need a little more separation. But as you get more established and as debt gets paid off, you have more cash flow, you have more flexibility, because remember, the role of the co-op is to take care of the people, not any individual. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Were you going to say something, Grant?
I was just going to say that one of the things you see in the economic literature is that people talk about the average contribution of a worker in a worker cooperative relative to the mean. So if you have a situation where the median worker in a cooperative is only so productive, and it's less than the mean, then if you have an equal pay in the cooperative, it's going to be a redistribution from the most productive maybe to the least productive. But there's reasons why people would be quote unquote more or less productive. They do different things within cooperatives. Some cooperatives will allow for people to share their jobs and to do different things. But if you're a cooperative like Mondragon, where you have manual labor, and then you have people doing engineering, it's not so easy to share responsibilities. And so that is kind of something that worker cooperatives have to work out. Some of them work that out by having pay differentials. Some of them have equal pay, but that is an issue that is addressed in the literature as well.
One other question from Danielle, specific to kind of the worker co-op experience. She's looking for referrals for lenders who specialize or have experience with SBA, USDA loans for cooperatives in rural areas. This might pertain to some of your experience, Kirk, with PPP. She's wondering if loan programs are still active during this time.
So SBA, we'll get into this in a little bit about what the SBA's directive is with some of the federal laws that are in place. And some of the resources that we have listed on that page can actually direct you to lenders that are really co-op aware and co-op friendly. And there's some technical assistance providers that have relationships with financial institutions. So I'll delay that. If we don't get to it, hit us at the end of this session, and we'll continue to explore that.
Many questions are still coming in, so I'm going to give you both a couple more and then maybe pause if that works for you to let you continue.
Sure. We'll get through a couple of these next slides. We'll go a little faster.
Okay. So another one from Michael. Does anyone know of an example where a co-op or set of co-ops makes explicit use of industrial symbiosis principles?
I'm not sure what the industrial symbiosis principles mean. What is that?
So let's ask Michael to help define that for us, and then we'll come back to him.
Okay.
I don't know what that means either.
Yeah, so Michael, if you want to chat that, we will follow up on your question. And then another question, in what ways does the co-op movement work with the labor movement? Where can there be alliances? Where are there tensions?
Yeah, the Mondragon has been working with labor unions in the United States as far as supporting worker cooperatives, and there's a union cooperative model that you can kind of follow. So there is some support with worker cooperatives and unions, and Mondragon has been central to that. Some cooperatives that are looking to form are actually seeking to get some financial assistance from Mondragon directly, and unions are actually involved in that as well. So there is a worker cooperative union model that is connected to Mondragon here in the U.S. So there is some work towards that.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to pause on the questions and hand it back over to you guys. But keep sharing your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get back to them a little bit later.
All right, so I'm going to take us through these first few points really quickly. The biggest thing is the biggest challenge that I see as a activist, advocate, and co-oper is the lack of awareness. People just don't even know what co-ops are. I mean, that's the air quotes, no one knows, but pretty much no one knows. And if you ask them, they probably don't even know what it is, even if they think they know what it is, because when I go, and I judge this when I go to my friends, it's like, yeah, co-op. It's like, why are you giving your business away? It's like, okay, clearly big disconnect. We don't know what's going on here. So that's just something we as a society and culture, and it happens because we don't know this when we're kids. Like, we should be learning this in grade school. This should not be a new thing that I'm learning in my 50s to figure out what to do. I mean, it's just crazy. It's silly. That's a problem. It's a little bit more complex to do because it's so new, and that's a challenge. So we need to take some of the complexity and the fear out of that, as well as the time. It takes too much time. Right? Typical conversion takes 12 months, 12, sometimes more. Sometimes it can get down to 6, but I can tell you in my case, we took just over 12 months, and I was pushing it. And I don't know how many owners will be pushing stuff because it's so unknown. So that's just a general challenge.
Yeah, there's a relatively small number of existing worker cooperatives, and there's studies that show the more cooperatives that actually exist, the quicker that they grow, which makes sense. If there's more cooperatives, people are more aware of them. There's more likely to be cooperative support organizations. But there is a relatively small number of existing cooperatives. They do have access in regards to accessing credit. Part of the reason is knowledge. Local financial institutions, even cooperative financial institutions, don't often understand worker cooperatives, so that can be an issue as far as accessing credit. And in general, with businesses, they're going to be more reluctant to take on debt given the current economic context. So there are issues as far as that goes. And degeneration refers to a situation where workers will leave a worker cooperative and they'll be replaced by non-owners. There were some studies done on worker cooperatives in the Pacific Northwest among plywood cooperatives. They did show that some of them did degenerate. Some of them did eventually convert to traditional businesses or were sold to traditional businesses. In Mondragon, an increasing percentage of the workforce has been the non-owner workforce, so people that aren't owners in the enterprise. So there is some evidence that there is some degeneration, but there's not the studies don't show that there's been a tendency towards degeneration among worker cooperatives.
So I'm going to take you through kind of the path that we took as a business, and I'm not going to get into significant detail on this, but I can, if you have questions about what we're doing. Again, we're going to provide you with all this detail. But one of the things that we did that was very important is we created an internal business development team, and this was about 13 or 14 of our employees got together on Sundays, our sacred time when we're closed in the morning, and spent time about 4 to 6 months figuring out how are we going to do this? What are we going to do? What does it look like? And worker co-ops was that model that we landed on. It overlapped with our culture. And then we engaged some expert resources. We got our team, the legal team, accounting team engaged. And then we went to create our constitution, our operating agreement, our Bible, if you will. We valued the company, we drew up all the documents, executed the transaction, and then we went to the process of signing on new members. And I guess the biggest thing I'm going to highlight on this slide here is culture is critical. If you don't have a culture that's collaborative or empowered, it's going to be very challenging to transfer that. So if not, you can't just take every company and just kind of throw a switch and boom, worker cooperative, congratulations. It doesn't work like that, because there's more responsibility that's put on the shoulders of the team that's there. And being transparent and inclusive as the entire process was I think really key. Making sure everybody knew what was going on, no one was surprised, everyone was brought along from the very beginning, all the way through the process. So how does, someone asked about the transition, like how did it work for us? So we are in general, how did it work? So this is a leveraged buyout in terms of you use future company profits to pay for the business, meaning you don't have to come up with a lot of down payment money. So that's something that, at least in our industry, people don't have an extra 100 grand laying around they can just drop down. So this allows them to participate as worker owners, and then the profits of the company will pay for that sale over time. We decided to finance internally and not do this externally. So we held a note as prior owners. It was competitive. We looked at what the rate was. I think our rate is, I think, 6%. That's a competitive commercial loan. It's maybe on the low side of a commercial loan in general when we did this 3 years ago. But it was, what we wanted to do is everything we did needed to be fair and need to be equitable so that we could show others that this is, and we documented, we paid a little bit extra to document everything that we did so we could share it with others and say, here's 85 to 90% that'll get you there. If you want to do this, here's our operating agreement, here's our decision matrix, here's our earnout agreement, here are all the things to get you started. And then you can tweak it and do whatever because co-ops can look any way you want. As long as you think about it, you can make it happen. And we used we had two companies, an S Corp and an LLC. We used the LLC actually to become the co-op itself that owns both businesses. So the LLC framework, it's very understood. It's, government actually understands that. There are tax laws that accommodate that. And so you don't have to create this whole new structure. You can use existing financial structures and legal designs to make it happen. There were challenges, and I think there continue to be challenges. I think we mentioned a couple of these, so I won't dwell on them, but awareness is the biggest. And what I think all of us on this call and all of people that are involved in this movement is to create awareness internally, to each other, to our community, to our friends, our family, and to our elected officials. There aren't a lot of resources locally. There's some great ones here in the Bay Area. Some of the experts nationally are here. DAWI is here, Democracy at Work Institute, Sustainable Economies Law Center, SELC is here. Project Equity is located here. They're the transition people that we worked with. And CCCD obviously is here. But in general, you can't just walk into your local SBA and say, oh, why don't you tell me about a co-op? And they're not going to be like, here, go down the street and here's some documents and go to the internet. They're not, just don't have that knowledge yet. It can be costly. Like we spent probably closer to 45,000 to convert our business because we spent extra time documenting. It doesn't have to be that much. We also went through a cohort and they did it kind of a la carte. They didn't use the legal teams that we did or the accountants that we did, and they did it for less than 10. So it can be done cheaper. It can be done a little bit more, if you kind of do the white glove service, if you will, where everything's being done methodically, that costs more. And again, everybody gets, these are lawyers that, they're co-op lawyers, but they're $350 an hour, right? Accountants, they're, Wegner, I think everybody in the country that's a co-op uses Wegner, CPA out of Wisconsin. They're $350 an hour, $300 or whatever it is. They're just, everybody's expensive. So it just because you're a co-op doesn't mean there's no discounts. So don't think of this as, we're all going to help each other. We all want to help each other, but you're still paying what the services cost. And that's part of the deal. Everybody gets paid fair and it's equitable. That's really a major part of this. One of the biggest things or three of the biggest things that I think are challenges here is traditional leases, where you have to have a personal guarantee. Credit cards, Chase, Citibank, they don't give a crap who co-ops are. They need a throat to choke. If you're not going to pay your bills, I'm going to come after someone. They don't care about this collective anything. And banks, even banks, I mentioned a credit union, still didn't have a process. They still wanted who's the owner, who's got the majority share. It's like, that just doesn't apply in this. You have to rethink some of what we do as a country and the institutions that are here. And then the last thing I'll share here, well, not the last, but almost the last. We do have requirements. So you can't not everybody can be a member. I mean, we open up membership to everyone, but you have certain qualifications. You have to, in our case, you have to work with us at least 12 months. So you have to be with us at least a year. And 1,200 hours. You can't work like one day a month and qualify. So we figure you need to be with us long enough to know our business. And you need to work 25 hours a week or more, because if you do that, we call that full time. And if you do that, that means you know enough about the business to make strategic decisions on the business's behalf, and that's important. Would you require a deposit when you start? With the membership fee, in our case, at $3,000, we require a $750 deposit. And that $750 deposit, if you decide to leave prior to the 2-year commitment that you make to the business actually keeps that. Otherwise, everything gets returned to the individual when they leave the co-op. They agree to sell their membership back to the business at the same rate that they got it for. And the last thing that we also require is that you're available outside of business hours to do meetings and board meetings, general meetings, and committee meetings and things like that. And with that, I am going to pause because I kind of went through a little bit quickly on that because I just wanted to make sure we have enough time for questions and some of the other material we have in here.
So more questions have definitely been coming in. I want to start with one that's a bit farther down the list, but it relates to something you specifically spoke about, Kirk. Rob is asking what you meant that the LLC owns both entities when you were speaking about a slice of New York.
So we have 2 businesses. And they were originally separate businesses. One was an S Corp and one was an LLC. And what we did is we combined all our assets into the LLC and then sold the LLC to the co-op organization. So the LLC became the co-op. So that's what I mean by both entities. We have a Santa Clara location and a Sunnyvale location. Those 2 entities, they have their own leases, they have their own assets. We combined those under the one LLC ownership and then sold that to the co-op. I hope that answered the question.
And then Michael jumped in with the definition of industrial symbiosis in the chat. It's the output of one becomes the input of another. So it's a no or low waste.
Gotcha.
So again, he's looking for an example of a co-op or set of co-ops making explicit use of these principles.
I'm not aware of anything domestically. I don't think there's enough of a cluster of cooperatives to allow for that, but maybe I'm missing something. I know with Mondragon, there's so many cooperatives in Mondragon that some of the cooperatives, the inputs from one cooperative will be, and then the output of one cooperative will be an input to another cooperative. So in that Mondragon corporation, there is something like that. Emilia Romagna is an area of Italy where cooperatives are extremely important. They're a large share of the economy there. And so there's a complex ecosystem there that does have some of that. And then in Argentina, in response to the there's been multiple economic crises in Argentina, but last decade or so, the worker cooperatives took over the factories in response to them being closed down. This was in the early 2000s. And they were often factories that would produce, they were in heavy industry, and they would use some inputs from other cooperatives in their production. So there is some of that. I just don't know if there's any examples of that domestically that I'm aware of. But maybe Kirk, I'm not sure.
No, I don't have any examples. But it seems like a natural fit when you find that one feeds the other. It'd be great to see more of that, but we need more.
Right, we need to see the growth of cooperatives and cooperative ecosystems. Yeah.
So Therese is saying that one of the cooperative principles is limited return on investment. This can make it difficult to attract investors. What are your thoughts about capital investment for cooperatives?
Yeah, that is a problem because I think a lot about the context in which the cooperatives exist. The present context, the economic context, the way the international economy has been created, there is an incentivization to drive down wages and to create a surplus within institutions. And that it is very attractive for investors, especially those that open themselves up to those markets. And there's also an incentivization towards the externalization of costs in various ways, environmental costs, social costs. Walmart is able to pay low wages because they externalize their costs onto the public sector. The public sector pays in food stamps and public assistance and things like that. Especially now with the current economic context, with public sector, the state and local government struggling financially, it is definitely hard to come by. And cooperatives, like other businesses, are struggling with the collapse in effective demand. So I think personally, if we're talking about direct financial support, it really is going to have to come, I think, from the federal government. The federal government has the capacity to create the currency, like I said, and it's going to have to inject more demand and have the money routed to businesses in order to give them direct financial support. I think that it's going to be very difficult in the present context to get public sector support from local and state governments, given their budgetary issues. So that is an issue, and I can't say that I have an easy answer to that.
Can't hear you, Gina.
I hear you.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm going to throw two more questions at you all before we head back into your presentation. The first one is, do all co-ops really follow the cooperative principles, including helping other co-ops? There are some co-ops listed as examples of the larger nature, so REI, Ocean Spray, Sunkist.
I think that in general, the answer is yes. I mean, I know we do. I can't speak for all co-ops, but just the nature of how you approach things, you tend to have a different mindset when you're an owner, a collective owner like that, and you know the struggles. You know the struggle is real, and when you're doing a lot of this stuff, and you need the support system of each other, and being like. I've talked to probably dozens of people that are thinking about it. I try and put myself out there to share what we've done to see if it's helpful for others, so I can explain what we did, and if they need help, I've already provided our operating documents and whatnot to help them, because we spent time actually creating that. I was always hoping to have a small presentation that I could sit down with a business owner and say, here, let's spend 20 minutes and 25 minutes I'll talk to you about what we went through to see if it's relevant for you, to see if it makes sense for you to consider. I haven't had a chance to finish that presentation. It's funny how when you get wrapped up in business, that time just evaporates like that. But I have a lot of the content.
The last question for now is, do policy changes come before or after people trying to form worker-owned co-ops? One of the limiting factors in my area is getting the word out, but I don't know if this should be a function of government, small business development entities, or a new organization.
I'm going to take a shot at that one, Grant. I know you have direct expertise in that, but I want to give a specific example when we come up, and if I could hold that question until, because I think that'll be answered in our next segment, if you will. Is that okay?
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
All right, cool. I just want to keep us on track. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're getting low. We're almost there. We're almost there, folks.
Yeah. So this is municipal support for worker-owned cooperatives or local sector support. Just to explain this slide, in the black bold there is an example of what can be done at the local level to support worker-owned cooperatives. And then in the parentheses are some cities that have done these things. So for example, support for business conversions. Kirk is going to be talking about this shortly. In Santa Clara, they've done this. Berkeley has set aside money, I think $100,000 for business conversions. Santa Ana, Atlanta, New York, and Austin. So there's been a number of cities that have put forward resources for businesses to convert to worker ownership. There's been some public sector resolutions supporting worker cooperatives, Santa Clara, of course, Santa Ana, and there's others. There's others that even aren't on this list. Rochester, New York, for example. I believe Minneapolis might have a resolution supporting worker cooperatives. A resolution for supporting worker cooperatives really raises awareness in the community. You'll often see when this happens, it'll make its way into the local newspapers, and it gets attention towards worker cooperatives. So that's a really important thing to organize, and you could focus your energies on the city council and local public sector people and economic development departments, planning commissions, and so on. Technical assistance, Santa Clara again, Minneapolis has something called CTAP, the Cooperative Technical Assistance Program, that gives a lot of really good technical assistance. Madison has a really good cooperative ecosystem, and New York has done an amazing job of technical assistance. New York actually has something called the Worker Cooperative Business Development Initiative. They've set aside millions of dollars, and they have these reports I would highly recommend everybody reading called Working Together. And they're annual reports that they produce in New York on how many cooperatives have been formed, how many workers and employees have been formed, how many workshops they've done. So they've done amazing work as far as technical assistance and also data collection. Educational campaigns, as Kirk was talking, that's extremely important. Many cities have done this. They've educated the populace. In order for there to be an education campaign, you need a champion in the public sector. You need somebody in the public sector. It's often mayors, but not necessarily. who's going to push for cooperatives, and that is central, at least for public sector educational campaigns. Loans and grants, multiple cities have done this. Cleveland is the model that a lot of people have followed. With the Evergreen Cooperatives, who I mentioned, the Cleveland municipal government got together with local anchor institutions. An anchor institution is an institution that's anchored in the community, and they have certain services where there's going to be a demand for them. For example, hospitals are going to need laundry to be done. So there's an anchor, which is the hospital, and the demand for laundry services, it provides an opportunity for a worker cooperative to be formed in the laundry services. And that's actually happened. It happened in Cleveland, and it happened in Amarillo, Texas recently as well. Government and anchor procurement. Cleveland is another example, again, of government procurement and anchor procurement. Amarillo, Texas, and Springfield, Massachusetts, following the Cleveland model, has recently opened an indoor hydroponic farm, like as Cleveland did. One of the cooperatives in Cleveland has an indoor hydroponic farm. And in Springfield, Massachusetts, they actually opened up one, and the anchor institution that they're selling to mainly is local hospitals and universities. So if you could identify anchor institutions in your community who procure services that worker cooperatives can provide, that's a good thing to focus on. Support for public banks. So there's two laws here in the state of California that are pushing for public banking. AB 857 is a pilot program. In the next 7 years, 10 local governments are going to be able to form public banks. And public banks have been central to the growth of worker cooperatives in other countries. And so in the next 10 years, you could see, the next 7 years, you could see as many as 10 different local governments forming public banks of their own. And there's a recent bill, AB 310, which is going to form a public bank at the state level. So the iBank is going to be potentially transitioned into a depository institution. It's going to be based on the Bank of North Dakota model. Bank of North Dakota is the only bank that is owned by a state government in the country. And so California potentially is going to be the second bank to have a public bank. And this could be an important means of supporting worker cooperatives. Getting back to the question earlier about financial support, if we really do a lot of organizing and reach out to politicians, we could really push for not only public banking to support worker cooperatives, but in some countries where there's a strong worker cooperative sector, they actually have a branch devoted just to worker-owned enterprises, cooperatives, ESOPs, things like that. And then also support for worker cooperative ecosystems. In the Bay Area, there's a really strong cooperative ecosystem, same with New York and Madison. So one thing you could do is support those ecosystems and cooperative support organizations as well.
And I'll follow on with that in terms of kind of at the local level and municipal level, you know, what's happening in Santa Clara. I can't talk to all municipalities, but I'm just going to run through just briefly what's happening in Santa Clara. Again, not going to go through all of these things, but just conceptually, once we opened up our cooperative, socialized that with local government, the council members and mayor, got them interested and excited about what this is and informed them. Got it to a committee, which then brought it to council. We did a full study session. You can see the study session on the slide there. That's the audience that was in there, and then in the lower left is the group that really came together to support this from multiple areas, multiple cities were there. But it came to the council study session, went back to that committee where they said, let's go forward with this. And the mayor was also part of that, very excited, unanimously supported, and suggested seeding it with $100,000 seed money to get this initiative started, which then went back to the council for approval, unanimous approval again, and then appropriated. And the key thing here, and the resolution was passed actually this year. So it was that was kind of back. Usually a resolution comes, then the money comes. The money came last year. But the big thing is it happened quickly. Less than a year, closer to 6 months is when the actual work took place. So just keep in mind, it doesn't have to take a long time. At the state level, Assemblymember Ash Kulra, he chairs the Labor and Employment Committee. He held a 2-hour information hearing last year with 2 different panelists entitled "Taking Worker Ownership, Worker Cooperatives, and Shared Prosperity." And it was 2 panels, an hour each, where you had experts on one panel and co-ops on the other panel. And it was really, really cool to see that level of, I mean, it was an official assembly, you know, a state event. To see that level of interest. And then just recently with the COVID crisis that has affected everybody, the experts came around and created a new coalition the Work Coalition, the Worker-Owned Recovery California Coalition. And it's a holistic, there's an agenda, it's a multi-page agenda that really goes through and tries to identify holistically, where can we make an impact now? And here's how we can make changes very, very quickly. We've already seen how quickly things can move. The government can allocate $5 trillion in a matter of weeks, and laws can change and policies can change very, very quickly when people are motivated, informed, and interested. So keep that in mind. You put the pressure on. This budget that went through in California back in June, we came up with this, our coalition came up working with Assemblymember Kansan Chu and Ash Kalra, came up with a letter of budget request for a $10 million appropriation that unfortunately did not get put through because of all the challenges. But we got 6 signatures on this and a couple signatures from the Senate, state senators, in less than 48 hours. That's how quickly things can move if you're motivated and you're engaged and you have a plan that makes sense, that resonates with people. So just know that just because it's big government or whatever it's out there, you don't let that intimidate you from engaging and thinking you can make a difference. And then the last one we're going to hit here on the federal level, for those that aren't familiar, the Main Street Employee Ownership Act of 2018 is the kind of foundational legislation nationally that really helps cooperatives. It directs, I have specifically listed there what it directs SBA to do, which is basically train and help fund or loan to cooperatives and employee ownership and worker ownership strategies. But additionally, to me, that's interesting. It doesn't have any funding, so it's not like SBA has money they can start spending. So that's not great. But what it does is it gets rid of that kind of red herring argument that what is a co-op anyways? It sounds like, yeah, this, collective this, it sounds hokey, it sounds like hippie things from the 60s and a bunch of ag or everyone smoking weed around a campfire and talking about how they're going to change the world. Well, this puts that to bed. This is federally backed concept model that works. And the federal government has already backed it and supported it with this. So that should put those kinds of discussions off to the side and get to that. Then you can have the discussion to get to the meat of it. Now, additionally, Congressman Ro Khanna, which is Silicon Valley's congressional representative, he's working on legislation, which is kind of like the next step after the Main Street Act. And it's in the final stages of legislative council. He's actually working with the federal government to get it as part of the next CARES 2 to some of those policies, as well as having it as a separate bill. He's going to be hosting a roundtable probably in late September. So if you want to hear about that, we encourage you to sign up on our listserv that we're going to share with you in just a couple slides. So stick around. If you want to look at it quickly, you can see there, Estonia.com/co-op will get you to that page, but we're going to show it to you in just a minute. And that is my pause once again, but I think we should still move forward because we're running out of time. What do you think, Grant? Or Gianna, what do you think?
Yeah, that works for us too. And depending on your time, like we could keep running with questions too, even if it goes past the end of the webinar, but totally up to you all and what time you can. I'm
good with that. I just want to make sure we get through the entire slide deck, with just a few more slides, everybody. It's just
Absolutely.
like 3 more. Just so that we can make sure we cover everything, and then we can do questions at the end.
That's okay. I prefer that as well.
Sorry, Grant, what were you going to say?
I would say I'd prefer that as well, if it's okay, because we're close to the end and we could answer some questions at the end if that's okay.
Awesome. I just was going to chime in and say, keep your eye on the chat, everybody. As Kirk talks about these resources, we're going to be dropping links in the chat and also the link to our evaluation.
Cool. So we try to identify some ways in which you can support the growth of worker cooperatives in your communities. Given the fact that there is difficult times financially for many people in the public and private sector, there are still things that can be done to raise awareness and to help the growth of worker cooperatives. I mentioned Jessica Gordon-Nemhard talking about the centrality of book clubs and discussion clubs in regards to the growth of cooperatives. So if you had the chance, get together with people in your community and discuss books, discuss cooperative economics, and through that, it often can lead to people on one hand having more knowledge of worker cooperatives, but also the formation of cooperatives themselves. Educate local financial institutions, anchor institutions, and legal professionals, among others, on cooperatives so you can reach out. I work in the public sector, and I've tried to push for things like housing cooperatives, limited equity housing cooperatives, And people that in the housing sector that I've talked to are supportive, but what they worry about is the lack of knowledge of cooperatives. And so money has to be set aside just to educate people. We can do that by reaching out and educating people on our own, so that when we get out of this situation economically, we're in a good position for these institutions to grow very rapidly.
And then one of the things from an activism perspective, which I encourage all of you to do, this is true incorporated in any project, and it's definitely true here. You need to find kind of a champion or executive sponsor. You need someone that you can reach out to that will carry the water with you and that has influence. So whether it's an elected official, ideally mayor, better, to be able to connect and to carry that message forward, which then goes to the next piece is get the council to pass a resolution. A resolution is basically saying that the city supports this idea. They craft out what that idea is, and they say, this is what the city wants to figure out how to invest its time and energy into. So there's no debate of what city staff needs to do. It is clear, because if you don't have that clarity, the city staff will interpret whatever they want to interpret because they don't have clarity from the council. A resolution is black and white clarity.
I mentioned briefly government procurement. So in Cleveland, there was a movement towards government procurement and also organizing government procurement among local anchor institutions. And so I know there's been discussion in Oakland about focusing on government procurement and giving bid preferences for worker cooperatives. So there are things that can be done in regards to government procurement, because government sometimes procures services from outside the community, even outside the state. That's money leaving the local economy. If you could have cooperatives form in sectors where the government can spend money into the local economy, that can be an important means of seeing the growth of worker cooperatives. And that's been the case in many other countries around the world.
And the last thing we're going to touch on this slide, and then we're just one slide away, is the concept of a worker cooperative academy. And this has been done in various ways, but the purpose of this kind of thought is, how can you create kind of like this boot camp or kind of compressed workshops, a series of workshops that allow people to understand what they're getting into before they actually commit to it. So to start off with kind of like a ballpark, saying, here's what you're expected to do, here's what you're going to be expected to do, here's what you need to get into, both owners and employees, so they understand what they're getting into, and then actually take them through it together in a compressed manner. So maybe it's 3 weeks, maybe it's 6 weeks, whatever that time frame is, but something that doesn't take months and something that's on a time horizon that works. So that's something that Grant and I and others are working on to try and explore and to see how that can be with other cooperative organizations. And this is our last slide. And this is a resource page that we put together. There's 2 links on here, as you can see. And we also have a 2-pager that was put together. I'm just going to click on the link here to show you where it goes. And this is the actual page over here. Whoops. And if you click on the co-op resources here, this will take you to a Google Drive with a bunch of folders on here. And in the background information, you'll see CCCD. That is this handout that you saw before. This is a 2-page handout that you can use. It's got contacts, websites, by area, and hopefully that's something that you'll be able to utilize and take advantage of. And that is, I think, that's everything. That's the ball game. Oh, and the very last slide here, we have sources that were put together so that you can go back and get more details from that. And I think, look at that. Oh, we're 1 minute over, 11:46.
Yeah.
Well, we still do have some questions coming in. So if you all have a couple minutes, I'm happy to share them with you.
Before we do that, I just want to thank everybody for sticking with us. Appreciate that. Appreciate your time. Just listen to us talk about our experiences and how the biggest thing is how we can get that message out and continue to advocate and be activists and help make economic change in our country. So thank you for participating.
I second that. Thank you. Thank you for the CCCD for hosting this. It's been a great experience. So thank you.
And we're going to stick around and continue to do Q&A. Yeah.
I'd like to say that it's been our pleasure, and we're extremely grateful for the experience and the expertise you both brought today, as well as just having the larger community here, the interest, the questions, the energy. There's been a lot of shout outs to Arizmendi and No Boss and A Slice of New York. So you can tell that people are very energized by this work and creating greater change amongst this movement.
Cool.
So with that, before we head into questions, I did want to make another plug for the chat. We have dropped in those links that Kirk shared in his final slide to the resources document, as well as the resources landing page. And then also please do click through to the evaluation, which is also in the link before you depart today.
And one last thing on that is this whole slide deck will also be placed in the presentations folder in that link. So if you get to that link, you'll be able to get to it.
Cool. So let's jump into a few more questions. Someone asked, do co-ops have to be for-profit? Are there nonprofit co-ops out there?
I would say just quickly that any enterprise needs to have some surplus, in the sense that you have to have money aside for depreciation of machines, or to invest to expand the cooperative, to hire more workers, a rainy day fund. If you have this crazy situation like a pandemic that causes mass economic chaos, I know that's crazy, but it could happen. So maybe it's not what you would call profit, but it's a surplus you have to generate within the institution. So I think any viable economic institution, any viable enterprise does need some internal surplus for just to run, to have money set aside for it to grow and to operate.
I would also quickly add to that childcare co-ops are actually structured, or can be structured, as nonprofits because they fulfill an educational mission. So just wanted to plug that based on the co-ops that we serve through our center. Next question. I am thinking of starting a sole proprietorship with the express intent of converting to a co-op. I'd like to prove that it works before converting. Any suggestions on what to do to steer the business into a cooperative?
So I'll take that one. So I would start off with cooperative principles, what they call open book management, meaning share everything. I had a light bulb moment. I probably should have shared this during when everyone else was around. When I was going through the cohort process, when we were going through the cohort process, where Project Equity hosted sessions where they bring guest speakers in. And one of the times they brought in Arizmendi, and there was like 20 of us in the room. I'm videoing it because I'm sharing it back with other teams, not live stream, but I'm videoing so I can capture and share with my team. And Arizmendi, this is the one in San Francisco bakery, which for those of you who don't know who Arizmendi is, they're the platinum standard for co-ops. They're the best. That the guy came in and put up his chart of accounts, his P&L, all his data on the screen, people's patronage accounts, who's making what, how much everything costs, where their profits are. And I'm looking at that and I'm like, Jesus, I don't know if I would share that level of detail with my own team. Right. And he doesn't even know who we are. Right. I mean, we're talking 20 strangers. And I mean, reality is I share most of that, but I mean, right down to, I mean, named accounts and everything else. And it made me think, it's like, well, why is there a problem sharing that information? Like, what's the issue? The only reason I could come up with for not sharing your financial information with someone is because you are concerned that someone's going to be upset when they see it. And no one should be upset that you're profitable. I mean, you want to be profitable if you're going to have a business. But if you're paying somebody 30 times more than somebody else, that might be something you don't want to share. That might be something that would, but co-ops inherently share data. And I couldn't think of a good reason why I wouldn't want to share all of that information. So from that point forward, that was over 3 years ago, we share everything. I mean, we were sharing a lot before, like in all our company meetings, but now we just share everything. So I would encourage you to have open book management style. You invite people to see how you run your business, why you make the decisions you make, where, you know, it's like everyone wants a raise, great. Where's the money coming from? It's not magic. You have a couple knobs you can turn those knobs and figure out what happens. So that to me is a recommendation, is act like you're a co-op before you are one. And then when you become one, it's just, you know, it's just some legal documents.
So this question, I believe you all have spoken to, but still gonna pose it to you in case there's additional thoughts you have. What legislative changes would facilitate cooperative business creation and conversion? Is there current or recent legislation proposed in the US to address this?
Well, so the one that Ro Khanna is working on right now, Congressman Khanna is working on, that's one of them. That's the next Main Street. That's the next step after Main Street. There's an iBank, as Grant was talking about, iBank reforms. Um, the, at least in California, the governor needs to, frankly, step up and start making awareness. And there needs to be a real campaign, frankly, on making people aware that there are other choices. I mean, we're going to have this, mass carnage of businesses right now in this coming out of this pandemic, or happening now. And if there's not awareness that these are models that people can look at, that's just that's frankly criminal. Everybody should be knowing it. Not to say that it fits everybody, not to say that everyone's going to do it, but if everyone doesn't know about it, that's negligent as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and the slide that I had before, when I mentioned money being set aside for the conversion conversions to worker cooperatives, I would reference that slide. I'll do a plug-in for the paper that I contributed to, the Cooperative Cities paper by Stacy Sutton, Dr. Stacy Sutton. We talk a lot about that in there. So there's lots of things that are being done at the local level to support the growth of worker cooperatives, but also conversions of worker cooperatives. So go back to the slide that we addressed some of the cities, and you could look up the examples that they're forming. Santa Clara is one of them. Santa Ana. There's some other ones in California that are allotting money towards that.
And the state paper that you're talking about is in that co-op info and resources Google Drive, which is a link off of that that page that you posted in there. At asony.com/co-op. If you go to that page, co-op info and resources, that'll take you to folders. It's in there. That's a great document.
Yeah, that was the focus of the entire paper. So I'll do a plug for the paper there.
Next question is, can an individual loan to co-ops or invest in co-ops? Are there regulations, requirements, minimum net worth? Where to find information on this?
So I actually investigated that a little bit. So the worker co-op specifically is designed to be equitable and really not to have outside influences. What you can do is you can take an equity position in a co-op, non-voting, you don't get a seat on the, well, you may get a seat on the board, but it'd be a non-voting seat. You can make it a concession. You can do whatever you want technically. There's no SEC. When you get into ESOPs, you get a whole different set of regulations. But with worker and I think there are different options. But with worker co-ops, you can take investment. If someone wants to say you want to sell 10% of the equity in the business, or you can structure it as a loan, or something that gets interest or something like that. You can do that. It does allow for that. We haven't done that, but you can do that if you need to raise money. The answer is absolutely yes.
And one state I would recommend, Wisconsin has a really well-developed cooperative law. So I would recommend doing some research on the cooperative law in the state of Wisconsin. They really do a good job of defining different types of cooperatives and equity and things like that. So if you have some time, try to study the state of Wisconsin's cooperative law. It's a good source. Lots of good ideas there.
I was also going to chime in that ag co-ops in the state of California have the option to offer preferred shareholder programs where independent individuals can make equity investments or even loans, and all of the kind of parameters of that preferred shareholder program are outlined by the co-op. So it's identified in the articles and the bylaws such that they set the investment amount and the return and other kind of considerations of that nature. Next question is, do you have any experience or advice for new businesses that want to start out as a co-op versus a conversion from an existing business? It seems that many co-op resources focus on conversions only.
I advocate around conversion simply because to me that's the low-hanging fruit. To how do you make it? We're trying to make a bit better market penetration, and how do you get more? How can you do that quickly? You can do that quickly through conversions. You can absolutely start up with co-op. I mean, you can absolutely do that. There are resources that'll help you do that, and the technical assistance people will help you do that too. Just know it. Like if I had to start off my business as a co-op, I don't know if I would do. It would be harder because I know how hard it is to start a business and all the decisions that have to happen in real time. You don't have time to screw around with, let's get together and have this meeting to do this, that, or the other. You don't have time to make some of those decisions. And it's not like you're making selfish decisions, but you just have to make decisions sometimes on the fly. And I'm not saying that can't be done. I absolutely can and is done. I just, it's harder. It's harder. I can't speak to that because I didn't do it.
One thing that I would mention as far as forming new cooperatives, I did mention government procurement. When the government procures services outside of a community, outside of the state, that's money leaving the state. And if you can form cooperatives in sectors where the government needs services, that is a good thing to focus on. So in your community, try to look and talk with city council members about that, about government procurement. Are they procuring services from outside of the community that they could be done and provided within the community? That could be a good example, a good opportunity to actually form worker cooperatives, because there's demand there that's waiting to be obtained, you know. So that's a good thing to focus on as government procurement at the local level.
And it should absolutely be done. I can't speak to that. I just know the struggles I went through in starting. And if it had to be done more than one voice, I think it would be difficult. You have to make quick decisions when you're starting a business sometimes. And I just think it would be, it absolutely can and should be done. I can't visualize that because I didn't go through it.
Next question, can you speak more to creating supportive local or regional ecosystems for worker cooperatives, e.g. policy, financing, NGOs?
Yeah, I mean, there's some places like some cities, Madison, New York, places like that, the Bay Area, that have very strong ecosystems, cooperative ecosystems. There's a lot of cooperatives. Because there's a lot of cooperatives and there's a lot of cooperative support organizations, a lot of people that we're talking about and the need to educate, you know, local officials, local politicians, people that work in banks, they're much more aware of those institutions. So a model to follow would be something like New York, Madison, the Bay Area, and in the sources that we provided, it does give some examples that you can kind of look up. But yeah, it's a difficult thing to create, especially like I'm in San Diego. There's a handful of worker cooperatives here, but they're so small that there's not really any cooperative support organizations at this point in time. And so somebody asked earlier about what comes first, you know, people pushing versus people in the public sector. It really does differ. You can't have somebody, and in Cleveland, for example, the person that led the push for cooperatives went to Spain and saw the Mondragon cooperatives in person. There was a mayor here in Richmond, California, who was influenced by Mondragon, and she pushed for it in the government. So it's something that can happen. It's difficult when you don't have existing cooperatives, and it's not something easy to do.
Yeah, in our case, like there's a couple cooperatives in the South Bay, not retail ones. We're the first retail brick and mortar worker cooperative in South Bay in Santa Clara County. So there was nothing here from a government perspective, like zero. So we did that, and we kind of pushed it up that way. But there's no reason you can't start from, you know, you can do it either way. It makes it better, frankly, if you can get support from the government to push messages down and have programs and assistance programs and loan whatever to help you look at that. That definitely helps, but you don't have to have it that way.
Next question, budget constraints may limit state and local public sector financial support, but could these entities use their regulatory authority to reverse the externalization of costs by traditional businesses?
That certainly is an issue. I mean, I have a pretty strong background in ecological economics, and that's one of my main focuses is the externalization of costs. I think that's more of a systemic issue at this point in time. But that's not really something that's easy to answer. I think in the modern context, like when I think of the global economy, a lot of companies are kind of able to go from one country to the other, and they're able to use the internationalization of supply chains so that when there are workers that are organizing unions or there's industrial strife, they can just shift production to different parts of the supply chain. And so that puts workers at a disadvantage, but it also puts companies that are at a disadvantage when they can't shift production overseas and they're stuck in a particular place. And so as far as dealing with the externalization of cost, that's really a systemic issue. It's not something that I don't know if it could be solved necessarily at the local level. It's my opinion. I know that might not be the best opinion, but it's a difficult thing to solve, definitely. The market economy, unfortunately, does not take into account lots of non-market impacts, and taking those things into account is not easy.
And I did want to quickly redirect folks back to the chat because other attendees are chatting in resources based on some of the questions coming through regarding preferred shareholder examples,
Awesome.
the Federation offering free webinars about how to start a co-op each month, Also another resource for forming a new co-op from Josh. So pay attention to what's coming through there, because the community has a lot of insight and expertise in this. Headed to the next question. Danielle is wondering if a separate nonprofit entity can be a worker owner of a co-op, or if it must be individuals as members only.
That's a good question.
Yeah, if it's one person, one vote, I don't know how you can have an organization be a member of a worker cooperative. That could be complicated. Yeah.
Yeah, I would. So the biggest message on like co-op formation and stuff like that I would give you is every co-op is unique. There's a lot of similar strategies and philosophies and fundamentals, but the reality is you know, every co-op is unique and can be created to meet whatever the demand or requirement is. And if you can think about it, if you can create the idea, all it is then you give it to the lawyers and let them figure out how to legally write it, and it's done. So I don't know if that's possible to do. Maybe there's a representative from the nonprofit that would sit on the board that can create influence. I guess my message on that is maybe there's no examples of that right now, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't pursue thinking about what it is that you're trying to gain from that and then make it happen, because this is all uncharted territory, and you shouldn't let current boundaries dictate what you do. Forget about precedent. You don't have innovation if you base everything on precedents and prior examples. So push the boundaries. Think about what you want, why you think that's important, and why you want to do that, and then fight for it and make it happen.
Yeah, just to follow up quickly, I mean, I believe very much in institutional diversity. I got that from Eleanor Ostrom as well. So I think it's possible. I just am not aware. And I think it could be difficult if you have one person, one vote. If one of the votes is an organization, it could be messy, but it's possible. And certainly I'd like to read about it happening. So go do it.
Yeah, I think absolutely. You should do it.
Yeah.
So the last question I'm going to shoot to you all is, any current movements to support people of color in cooperative development that you can speak to?
Yes, most definitely. Jessica Gordon-Emhart, like I said, her book on collective courage is really a valuable asset. She's been talking a lot. She has a lot of published articles. She actually has an article for the Next System project as well about worker cooperatives within the African American community. There's also something in Jackson, Mississippi called the Jackson Cush campaign. And the current mayor is Mayor Lumumba. His father was the prior mayor, and he came out of the movement there. And part of the Jackson Cush campaign, one of the central parts of it is actually worker ownership and worker-owned enterprises. And so they're basing themselves on the Mondragon example, actually. And so if you have time, I would read the Jackson Cush campaign and look at Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi. It's in the heart of the South, so it's extremely interesting.
And I just have seen part of the Work Coalition efforts is to review and give feedback and input with some of that new legislation that's coming out that Congressman Khanna is working on, just giving input and just kind of being extra eyes on this. And there's a lot of language in there about minority areas being focused on, and how can you help disenfranchised areas in general, and have this be something that will help lift that up. So that's absolutely a heavy focus, and there's different strategies. Do you target districts? Do you target area? How do you define some of that? I think is some of the challenge when we were talking to assembly members and senators going around that budget request. So we got to learn a little bit about that. And I did see one note asking about, when we formed as a co-op, did we use California's law as a co-op, or do we use LLC? We used the LLC. We did not use it. We use, I think it's LLC Chapter S or something like that, Chapter C under the LLC thing. I can look. I'll look it up. I can look that up. But it's operating as a cooperative company as an LLC.
I just want to add just quickly to what I just said about cooperatives in the African American community. Broadly speaking, there's studies that show, there was a study by the Federal Reserve that showed that African American business owners paid on average 33% more in interest rates when they took out loans. And there was a survey done by Wells Fargo that tried to get the attitudes and the opinions of minority business owners. And what they found was that African American business owners in general had harder time accessing credit. They had less in reserve at times when times got tough. And they sometimes operated in environments where there was sometimes less effective demand. And so I think part of the push for cooperatives is part and parcel to a larger project, which is to address these structural issues in society. So that's kind of the domain, I think, of national policy and local policy. It's a systemic issue, I think, that has to be addressed.
And if I can jump in, I wanted to put in a plug. I believe Marguerite chatted Repaired Nations as another organization to check out that are supporting people of color in co-op development, as well as I wanted to mention the Federation of Southern Cooperatives in tandem with what Grant was saying in regards to Cooperation Jackson. The Federation is doing a lot of work in cooperative development and land retention among communities of color in the South.
It's in the cooperative resource guide that we handed out. So in that guide that we created, that organization's in there as well. So.
And with that, I think we are ready to wrap up. I'm seeing Joanna is asking if you all have shared contact information. We have not distributed contact information for them.
Yeah, we didn't do that. I don't think any of our slides actually have our contact stuff. Well, before we upload the slide to that directory, I'll just put our emails on there, so there's a way to get in touch with us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Kirk and Grant. It has been a wonderful morning with you both, as well as thank you all to the participants and attendees that stuck with us here now that we're at 12:10. Really, really stoked on this discussion and all the information that was shared today.
Well, thank you to everybody, and thank you for people that are chatting and came, and thank you for the CCD and Kirk and everybody else.
Yeah. Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Grant. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Okay, everybody, take care.